Hello, my name is Patricia Farnese and I'm a professor with the College of Law at the University of Saskatchewan. This is a presentation that I gave to interested delegates to the 13th meeting of the Conference of the Parties of the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands this fall in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. For those of you unfamiliar with Canada, Saskatchewan is a prairie province in the west of the country. It's quite a big place, just under 652,000 square kilometers. It has a population, though, of just 1.2 million people. Most of the people live in the bottom third of the province. 10% of the landmass is fresh water, but most of that water is in the north and is inaccessible by roads or other railways, those types of things. And in the wintertime, you can sometimes go up through ice roads, but most of that is canoe-in, fly-in kind of environment. We are very fortunate in Saskatchewan to be a province that's richly endowed with natural resources. In the south, agriculture is a dominant feature on the landscape. We are the largest exporter of lentils, dried peas, and oats, but you'll see canola, like in the photo here, the yellow flowers on the left, and flax. Wheat and barley as well are quite common. We have grazing, cattle, and sometimes bison. There's a poultry industry, as well as pork growing in the province. In terms of other natural resources, we're the largest producer of potash. We also have uranium exported, and we're the second largest producer of oil and gas in Canada. Even though comparatively the oil and gas sector is more dominant in our economy, it represents about 20% of our economy versus 7% from agriculture, forestry, and wildlife. Certainly the sentiment in Saskatchewan, or the importance of our agricultural lands, our forestry lands, and our wildlife are well recognized. Saskatchewan people enjoy spending significant amounts of time hunting and fishing and just being on the land outside of urban centers. You know, we're a province that's maybe just 1 or 2 generations of urban dwellers, and so most people have a connection to rural and more natural landscapes. The bottom third of the province falls within what's known as the prairie pothole region. This region is characterized by what's perceived as small and isolated wetlands. They often fall on private land, and they are subject to dry and wet cycles, meaning that they can be dry during different parts of the year and wet during others. This is just an aerial photograph of what a pothole region might look like, and so some of the wetlands are actually quite large, but you can see that they're just these depressions that fill up with water and can dry down. I said in the previous slide that they're often perceived as being isolated, but new research coming from the University of Saskatchewan actually has demonstrated that these potholes actually are often formed in a network whereby the potholes will spill and move on and slow water in a coordinated way when we have large rain events. Now this is a more ground level view of what a pothole can look like. They're often found on private land and so are right amongst other competing land uses. And in Saskatchewan, one of the major competing land uses is agriculture. Certainly these types of wetlands are under threat around urban areas as a result of urban expansion, as well as exploration for oil and gas, for instance. But agriculture seems to be a place where the compatibility of wetlands on the landscape with agricultural lands often are viewed as in conflict. And so because they're these small isolated wetlands, they are particularly vulnerable to degradation and drainage. I think it's important to pause here and provide a little bit of background to give you some of the context for agriculture in the region. I think from this context, when you appreciate the scale of agricultural operations in the province, you can understand why potholes within an agricultural operation can be perceived as a problem and something that needs to be removed in order to have efficient farm operations. The average farm size in Saskatchewan is 1,784 acres. The size of equipment that is used to just manage ag operations at that scale is quite large, and so it's difficult to maneuver, or it can be difficult to maneuver that type of equipment around isolated potholes. It also costs money in time when margins on farms are quite small, and so producing the most amount of crop that you can on your property is sometimes the difference between surviving one year and not. Turning a profit, I mean, or not. And so there is a lot of pressure on farmers to drain wetlands just to keep up with the demands of farming. I want to turn now to the main focus of my presentation, which is the Quill Lakes. I'm speaking today about the Quill Lakes because I think they provide a good example and case study of the conflict that can arise when there is not comprehensive strategy for managing wetlands in an agricultural landscape. The Quill Lakes are a Ramsar site. They were designated in 1987, and they are a complex of 3 lakes totaling about 65,000 hectares. They are a saline lake complex with salinity that can vary quite largely based on how much water is in the complex at any given time. Perhaps my map on the other page better demonstrates this, but the Quill Lakes are a very large complex in a region of Saskatchewan that really doesn't have a huge population. They are surrounded by agricultural lands and can be quite beautiful. The Quill Lakes is either defined as a closed or semi-closed basin. You can see in the bottom left-hand corner the Last Mountain Lake, which is also a Ramsar site, and that connects into the Quill River system, which moves into Manitoba and connects into other jurisdictions, including into the United States. So here we have actually an area that has overlapping jurisdictions with rural municipalities, different provinces. The federal government has some jurisdiction on navigable waters. There are First Nations. The yellow on the maps there are different First Nations that have jurisdiction. And as I said, Manitoba and the US are also interested in the water that moves in and around this area because it is not stopped by national borders. The Quill Lakes are an important bird area, and one of the key designations for it being designated as a Ramsar site is because it's got important nesting and staging grounds for water birds. It's also part of the Western Hemispheric shorebird reserves, and during migration there can be up to 85,000 geese, 100,000 ducks, 12,000 cranes, and many endangered species. As you can see from the side, the Quill Lakes is an important recreational place as well, as many bird viewing opportunities have been put in place, and in fact infrastructure had been built to support those kinds of activities among the sort of 3-ish lakes that make up the Quill Lakes complex. This is just a list of some of the species that you may see at the Quill Lakes depending on the time of year, and as a saline water body, they are an important nesting ground for these shorebirds. And so we see avocets and plovers and cranes, including the whooping crane, that will come and use here as nesting grounds. To many people's surprise, in the middle of the prairies we also have pelicans. The The series of aerial shots over time really demonstrate how much the Quill Lakes total area has expanded since 2007. There's been approximately 30,000 acres of private land and 35,000 acres of crown land flooded as a result of the growing amount of water flowing into the Quill Lakes.
This slide and the subsequent 7 slides demonstrate the extent of the flooding and the impact it has had on investments to draw tourists to the area, the impact on infrastructure to support birding and wildlife viewing in the area has been significant. You have to remember, these are small towns away from urban centers that have not the largest tax base, so have relied on grants and support of NGOs to build some of this infrastructure. It's not clear that when the waters recede that this infrastructure will be first safe, or if there will be funds available to replace them if they're not. Earlier I mentioned that there's been 30,000 acres of private land flooded. Most of this land is agricultural land and have been under, during dry years, crop production. The impacts then to agriculture have been significant. Insurance losses and disaster payments have been available sometimes, but over repeated seasons, eligibility becomes an issue. Farmers can't plant. They are suffering crop losses as water moves during any given season. Salination is a problem, as well as increased nutrient runoff and sedimentation into the water bodies as a result. This and a number of photos that follow behind, again, the comparison photos can demonstrate the extent of the impact to private lands of all of this water coming onto the Quill Lakes. Well, crop land certainly is being affected. We do know also that those who are grazing cattle have seen consequences as a result of the flooded quills as well. Certainly disease is a problem when there's more water on the landscape. We've had calf deaths as a result of contamination of wells that were being used to water cattle as the flood waters swamp into those freshwater wells. Fences that are meant to keep animals inside the farm boundaries certainly are being broken down and eroded away. And generally, those who grow feed to support cattle can't also grow feed to support them. If the photographs of the lost cropland doesn't alarm you, it's not just farmland that's lost or the infrastructure from fences or the odd grain building. It's actually people's homes that are suffering as a result of these growing land waters. These pictures here are particularly shocking, right? Where you see what would be pasture or cropland to what almost looks like a view out into an ocean where you can't see the land on the other side. It's striking how much water has come into this area in the last decade. Well, I'm not meaning to diminish the significance of the impact that those private landowners have suffered whose land happened to be next to the Quill Lakes, but you could perhaps not be surprised that this didn't draw a lot of attention if you thought that that were the only impacts. In fact, the impacts have also grown to such an extent that some major public infrastructure is also impacted. We've seen road closures and highways affected, and one of the two major rail lines across the province, across the country really, are also impacted by these floodwaters. And so the next couple of slides will just really highlight what I mean by the impact to the public infrastructure as a consequence of this. Although it's not the clearest photo, what this is here is one of two major transportation routes across the country. This is a highway, and we move significant amounts of goods and people across the country on this highway. It's not meant to go through water. It was built across what was agricultural lands, and so that pressure of the water onto the highway erodes the supports of that highway, and at various times that route has been closed as the safety of the road needs to be assured and shored up, really, the sides shored up so that we don't have a failure of that roadway. This results in hours-long delays because there are few alternative routes than this route. And so if you are redirected, you're looking at a major delay or extension of your trip by not a few minutes. We're talking hours in this place. And here's a photo of the rail line that I was talking about that's now being flooded by the Quill Lakes. You know, the pressure of water onto those supports that is holding up that rail line is significant, and there is real questions by many as to whether this rail line risks failure, given that it was not built to push back water. What you're looking at here is a map of the Quill Lakes, and the red is all of the drainage that's going into the Quill Lakes. I did say earlier that we are in a period of extreme amounts of water on the landscape, that we're at what we hope to be the high point in a wet-dry cycle. But it is estimated that if we just close the unauthorized drainage, we could reduce the amount of water going into the Quill Lakes by 38.5%. That's a significant amount. One has to question whether this Quill Lakes should be listed on the Montreux record, because the Montreux record of the Ramsar Convention are those wetlands that are being negatively impacted or degraded by human activity. This clearly shows that human activity is impacting this wetland, and it has changed as a result, changed for the worse. And so it is, I would think, a good candidate for the Montreux record. Well, any one farmer draining his land is likely not going to have a huge impact, but as water flows downstream, farmers who are drained on drain in response, and the water continues to move, and additional waters are also drained and carry on down to the terminal basin, and in this case that's the Quill Lakes. The next number of slides really just show what drainage looks like on the prairies in this region. You can see that isolated wetlands would fill up and then spill on occasion when they've reached their capacity and run down to the next pothole, which would fill up and run down in sort of a slower kind of process. What drainage does then is connect in a very instant way the waters between these isolated potholes or perceived isolated potholes and move them downstream quickly and with great effectiveness. The drainage that's happening is not incidental. It has significant coordination on occasion, and it involves big earth moving equipment. We're moving lots of water off of the landscape, and in most cases we're doing so without appropriate regulatory approvals. I think this slide more than any demonstrates the pressure that farmers must feel to drain their land. Here we have a landowner who clearly is suffering directly from land loss as a result of the growing Quill Lakes, yet the land right adjacent to the land that he's losing to the growing water body is being drained. Margins are tight, and so there is pressure to bring every last bit of land into production to meet your bottom line. Clearly, we have crisis in the Quill Lakes, and unfortunately, the fact that this problem has been allowed to grow and grow and grow without regulatory action to come up with a plan to address drainage and conservation needs in this area, we're seeing conflict between neighbors. First, we have the property owners who are directly affected by the growing Quill Lakes because their property has either been lost to or contaminated by or are under direct threat of loss as a result of the size of the Quill Lakes growing. They're one of those people who've lost some of that 30,000 acres of land. We also have people concerned about the breeding grounds for all of those migratory bird species, shorebirds that come to the Quill Lakes and see the Quill Lakes as essential breeding grounds. No one really knows what the long-term impacts of not being able to breed in the Quill Lakes will be. We don't know if the birds will come back if the waters recede, and we don't know what the lasting impact on the health of the numbers of these species, and species that are endangered like the piping plover. One of the proposals that went forward was from a group of landowners, and these landowners may not directly live within the Quill Lakes per se, but do rely on the Quill Lakes as an outlet for water that's being drained off of their land. Now, they are quite rightly upset about the volumes of water that's moving onto their lands as upstream landowners are draining onto them, and they equally are losing cropland to more and more water being found on their property. And so as they too struggle with trying to farm in tough times, they feel that pressure to drain and move water. And so some of those landowners came together and proposed what was to be a diversion channel, which would drain or ditch, I should say, the Quill Lakes into some adjacent streams, I guess would be the best way to describe them, which could move the water into Last Mountain Lake. Now, Last Mountain Lake is, as I mentioned before, a Ramsar site, but it is a freshwater site, and so when that proposal was put on the table, those who rely on Last Mountain Lake or for recreation, for drinking water, for their homes being around them, for instance, were upset by this proposal out of fear that saline water mixing with fresh water could do lasting damage to the ecosystem of Last Mountain Lake. And so we saw a conflict between those landowners now and those more upstream from the Quill Lakes area. Interestingly, this is navigable waters, it is fish habitat. We haven't seen the federal government come in at all and provide any guidance or support as to what should be done in this region. The last group that is impacted by the Quill Lakes are the First Nations who, because there is a duty to consult with First Nations, they were able to prevent this diversion channel from going forward because they were not properly consulted with. Ultimately, the proponents withdrew the proposal, and the province made a commitment to the First Nations that they would not proceed in the future without an environmental assessment. So here we are, is a problem yet without a solution. And so we have a crisis now in a situation where the solution is not readily apparent because there was no transparent process to try to solve this problem up until this point. The stakeholders are now in conflict and there's very little trust among them. The chances of these parties coming together to solve this in a way where each people's interests are considered and accommodated is very unlikely. And so why be concerned about the Quill Lakes? Well, the regulatory and governance failures that are occurring in the Quill Lake regions are being repeated across the prairie pothole region. And as a consequence, the essential ecosystem services that wetlands provide in that region are being degraded and in some cases entirely lost. The ability of these wetlands to mitigate floods and droughts, they're losing the capacity to retain and remove nutrients from the environment before they move into the navigable water systems. Their role in groundwater recharge is something that we're just starting to understand, and if the water is not on the landscape, we may be irreversibly impacting our groundwater resources. And as mentioned, these wetlands, as the Quill Lakes in particular, are important ecological habitat for many of the species that we rely on for food, but also for pleasure, in the sense that, many of us go to rural areas to see wildlife and wild spaces. Well, certainty in an era of a changing climate is something that we cannot necessarily rely upon, but we do know that over time we can expect that change will happen and that weather events will be more extreme. We will have hotter, longer periods of drought and wetter, more extreme periods of wet. This means that the role that wetlands play in the environment may be needed even more significantly. Those gatekeeping behaviors are explained on the next slide, and we will need those in a changing climate. And so as we move forward to address the conflicts that are arising in the Quill Lakes and other areas, there's still a lot of science challenges that need to be met before we can have really good and informed decision making about wetlands. One of the key areas that needs to be addressed is the fact that we have no comprehensive or consistent wetland inventory of prairie wetlands. So we don't even know where the wetlands are. And as such, we cannot document or identify those wetlands that are of absolute importance for the ecological services they provide in their immediate areas. We don't understand when and where trade-offs among ecosystem services of different wetlands become important, and we don't know what level of functioning a wetland has to have before it's not able to provide those ecological goods and services. we could also better understand the economic drivers of drainage of wetlands. Finally, my colleagues at the University of Saskatchewan Global Waters Futures, who provided the last couple of slides and who are also studying these science challenges, are looking at what social institutions can help inform drainage management, as the infrastructure that we have today is woefully lacking in transparency, in confidence, and in diverse perspectives. The Quill Lakes offer an interesting case study for the failure of wetland management in an agricultural landscape. Saskatchewan has never adopted a comprehensive wetland strategy which seeks to balance the needs of all stakeholders. Rather, they have taken an approach that prioritizes the interests of agricultural drainage. Consequently, those with other interests feel unheard and overlooked in the process to solve this problem. Moving forward, we need to develop new water governance institutions and policies that make way for different perspectives and different interests if one hopes to ever solve the problem like what we have in the Quill Lakes. Thank you for your attention.